In 1856 Virginia, the plantation system functioned as a rigid mechanism that tolerated no deviation from its internal order. Fields stretched outward from the main house in carefully measured rows, each section overseen by men who recorded output and punished shortfalls with predictable efficiency. The enslaved workers moved within this environment as components in a hierarchy designed to maximize labor and minimize resistance. Dawn marked the start of forced routines, and every movement from that moment forward could be observed and interpreted as compliance or defiance. The landowner, rarely present outside the main house, delegated almost everything to overseers whose authority was reinforced by the nightly movement of local vigilante riders who patrolled the roads and the surrounding woods. Their presence was never constant, and yet the possibility of their sudden arrival created a pressure that shaped decisions throughout the plantation. These riders acted on rumor, suspicion, and fear of insurrection, and their actions, sometimes aligned with the law, often not, expanded the reach of control beyond the plantation's fences. Within this structure, the main character operated with a level of caution that appeared to be simple obedience, but was in fact the groundwork of something far more deliberate. He repaired tools, carried water, and performed his assigned tasks with an attentiveness that allowed him to observe the schedules of others without drawing notice. He studied how the overseer made his rounds, how long the landowner stayed indoors before stepping outside, how the younger white farmhand lingered near the barns before heading toward the road, and how the enslaved workers reacted to shifts in routine. His actions were efficient but unremarkable. The overseers saw a quiet worker who kept his head down. The enslaved community saw someone who avoided unnecessary conflict. Only he understood that each small observation built toward a larger understanding of the vulnerabilities around him. Short moments of memory intruded only when a gesture or a sound triggered them. The raised whip in the overseer's hand brought back the echo of an earlier punishment that had left lasting scars on his back. The sound of heavy boots on packed dirt reminded him of the night riders who once dragged him out during a mistaken accusation of collaboration with an escaped slave. The flashbacks were not sentimental recollections. They were reminders of the precision and cruelty of the system he lived under. They taught him the value of silence, the danger of panic, and the necessity of recognizing patterns in those who held power. His earlier attempt to escape had been impulsive and doomed by overconfidence. Now, years later, he moved with a different understanding. Escape required more than courage. It required manipulation of the forces that oppressed him. Secondary figures in his world contributed to the tension that shaped his decisions. An elderly enslaved man, recognized by all as someone who carried the memory of 3 generations of suffering, often warned him that unusual competence drew dangerous attention, and that planning too openly risked involving others who could not withstand the consequences. A boy barely in his teens watched the main character with admiration, unaware of the depth of calculation behind his behavior. The overseer maintained authority through unpredictable punishment, striking quickly for minor offenses to remind the enslaved people that their safety was temporary. A white farmhand, rumored to be loosely affiliated with the vigilante riders, drifted around the edges of the plantation's daily operations, listening more than he spoke and carrying information both upward and outward. The landowner appeared in public only when necessary, projecting a distant control built on anxiety that the simmering fear of rebellion might one day materialize. The early spark of conflict emerged not from a dramatic event, but from a small fracture in the nightly routine. One evening, while the main character was returning from storing tools in the shed, he noticed 2 night riders near the edge of the tree line. They did not see him, and he paused in the shadows and watched them argue in low voices. Though their words were not entirely clear, the tone was unmistakable: accusations, mistrust, and a suggestion that someone within their own group had violated expectations or shared information without authorization. The rider's body language revealed a tension that did not belong to men who felt secure among their peers. They parted abruptly, each heading in a different direction. The moment lasted less than a minute, yet it carried more significance than any overt confrontation. For the first time, he witnessed evidence that the men who patrolled with absolute certainty were not unified. They were capable of turning on each other. An hour later, while walking near the slave quarters, he noticed a scrap of cloth half hidden under loose soil. It bore the distinctive pattern used by the local riders. Someone had been near the cabins without the overseer's involvement, and the secrecy implied unauthorized surveillance. The implication was clear. The night riders did not trust each other enough to share information about their movements. They were searching for something, or someone, without coordination. This discovery fused with the earlier overheard argument to form a single, far more potent understanding. Disorganization existed within the very structure designed to enforce order. Daily life continued outwardly unchanged, yet a new layer of tension formed beneath the surface. The main character moved through his tasks with the awareness that a fault line existed within the enemy's ranks. He began testing the boundaries of his observations, noting how often the riders appeared, where they looked first upon arrival, and which paths they took when patrolling the outskirts. He watched the farmhand leave the plantation late at night more frequently than usual, and he noted that the overseer seemed increasingly frustrated with the lack of clear information about recent regional disturbances. Each small interaction added texture to the social landscape he navigated. The older enslaved man cautioned him again after noticing his increased attention to the woods, insisting that the night riders were unpredictable and that nothing good could come from trying to understand them. The younger boy asked questions that the main character answered only with vague warnings. The overseer punished 2 field workers for working too slowly, claiming that slack in pace indicated distraction or possible planning. These punishments, though not linked to the night riders directly, were symptoms of the broader tension spreading across the area. The landowner privately instructed the overseer to tighten discipline before harvest season ended, a command that quickly resulted in longer work hours and reduced allowances for rest. The first spark of conflict expanded when the main character witnessed a morning inspection of the slave quarters in which the overseer seemed unusually agitated. He questioned several people about unfamiliar footprints near the cabins, insisting someone had been out late or meeting with outsiders. The enslaved workers denied involvement, but the overseer's skepticism amplified the uncertainty already brewing among them. The main character remained silent, watching how fear spread in both directions, enslaved people fearing punishment, and the overseer fearing the collapse of control. Over the next few days, small signs of instability appeared. The night riders' presence increased, yet their movements lacked coordination. Some arrived in groups, others rode alone. They avoided looking at each other for long and spoke briefly, as though they feared expressing too much. The main character interpreted their disarray as both danger and opportunity. Unpredictable men were dangerous, but divided men could be manipulated. The decisive shift occurred when he recognized that the tension among the vigilantes could be weaponized. It was not a conscious plan formed in a single moment, but a gradual conclusion. If they suspected each other, then a carefully placed rumor or misleading detail could intensify their existing distrust. Such manipulation would be safer than attempting escape alone. The riders had weapons, authority, and freedom of movement, but they lacked unity. If he could deepen their suspicion, they might damage themselves without ever realizing they were being guided. He did not yet know how to do this, and the scale of danger remained immense. If even one rider or overseer detected his intentions, his death would be immediate. The few people around him who suspected he wanted more than survival would never willingly assist, not out of disloyalty, but fear of the consequences. Still, he began thinking in terms of possibilities rather than limitations. The section ends with the main character alone near the edge of the fields at dusk, observing the riders gathering for another patrol. Their movements were stiff, their shoulders tense, their glances evasive. Their horses shifted uneasily, as if sensing the tension between the riders. He recognized the significance of the moment. The system that oppressed him was not a monolithic force. It was a structure built on fear, hierarchy, and unstable loyalty. If its foundations were unstable, then they could be used against it. The first spark had occurred, and though no one else perceived the shift, he understood that the path ahead, dangerous, uncertain, morally fraught, had already begun. The tension that had begun as a subtle fracture within the vigilante riders grew more visible in the following days, though it manifested in ways that only someone accustomed to reading suppressed emotions could detect. What had once been the predictable rhythm of night patrols and daytime labor became a landscape of sudden interruptions, inconsistent behavior, and an undercurrent of anxiety shared by both enslaved workers and their overseers. The plantation's routines still functioned, but they did so with the strained quality of a machine with unseen internal damage. The main character moved through his tasks with deliberate attentiveness, recognizing that events were shifting more quickly than the people around him realized. The consequences of the earlier overheard argument among the night riders were beginning to ripple outward, and he understood that opportunities and dangers would emerge in equal measure. One of the first indicators appeared during the next morning's work assignment. The overseer arrived earlier than usual, carrying a list of names written hastily on a scrap of paper. His posture was tense, his boots leaving deeper imprints in the dirt as he walked. He checked the quarters more thoroughly than usual, opening barrels, lifting sacks, and inspecting corners with the kind of urgency that suggested he was acting on information he did not fully trust. He seemed to believe that disobedience or conspiracy could erupt without warning. The enslaved workers sensed his agitation and adjusted their movements accordingly, avoiding prolonged glances at each other and keeping their bodies aligned with whatever direction the overseer faced. The main character noticed that even the farmhand who normally lingered with casual interest appeared unusually cautious, as though expecting an argument or reprimand. By midday, the pressure escalated with new rules imposed without explanation. The overseer ordered that all tools be locked in the barn after use rather than left in designated racks. The enslaved workers were instructed not to move between work groups without permission. Even the act of carrying water between fields required visible supervision. These changes were framed as precautionary measures, but their purpose was transparent. Someone among the whites believed that a threat, imagined or exaggerated, existed within or near the plantation. The main character recognized that such restrictions were often a response to rumors, and he suspected that the internal discord among the vigilantes had already begun to distort into assumptions of external subversion. Later that afternoon, he initiated the first deliberate manipulation, subtle enough to avoid detection, yet potent enough to influence the already fragile environment. While repairing a damaged wagon wheel near the stables, he positioned himself within earshot of the farmhand, who was stacking crates and muttering under his breath. The main character allowed a few carefully constructed comments to pass between two enslaved men who he knew the farmhand routinely observed. These comments, disguised as idle speculation about unusual visitors to a neighboring plantation, suggested that one of the local vigilantes had been meeting secretly with people from outside the region. The tone of these comments was neutral, as though the information held no personal value. The content, however, was chosen with precision, vague enough to avoid suspicion of intentional deceit, yet specific enough to anchor itself in the mind of someone already anxious about disloyalty among his peers. The effect emerged quickly. The farmhand paused more frequently during his work, glancing toward the main character with a mix of curiosity and unease. By evening, he left the plantation sooner than usual, his departure marked by hurried steps and an avoidance of eye contact. The main character watched him go, recognizing the shift as confirmation that the rumor had taken root. He understood that it would likely spread among the vigilantes within hours, interpreted according to their existing fears. The vulnerability he sought to exploit was not their hatred, but their lack of trust in each other. The next day, visible consequences began to surface. The vigilantes arrived in smaller groups rather than as a unified patrol, and their interactions were noticeably strained. Two men inspected the southern fence line and exchanged words that carried the rigid posture of reproach rather than cooperation. Another rider questioned the overseer about unfamiliar activity near the slave quarters, though the overseer himself appeared confused by the inquiry. The lack of coordination between them reinforced the main character's understanding. Distrust was no longer an undercurrent. It had become a defining feature of their operations. This growing insecurity manifested in harsher treatment of the enslaved workers. The overseer, uncertain of what information the vigilantes possessed, interpreted all deviations from routine as potential signs of conspiracy. One man who paused for a moment longer than usual while lifting a barrel was accused of signaling to someone in the woods and received a public beating. Another was punished for speaking too quietly during roll call, the overseer insisting that whispered communication indicated the sharing of secrets. These punishments reflected not actual disobedience, but the overseer's fear that he was losing control. The enslaved community felt the pressure instantly. Each person shortened their movements, compressed their speech, and avoided any gesture that could be misread as intent. The main character watched these developments with rising tension of his own. His plan required that the vigilantes turn against one another rather than redirect their paranoia entirely toward the enslaved population. He recognized that each punishment inflicted on innocent people added weight to his moral burden. He had not intended for his actions to produce suffering among those who had no role in the conflict he sought to manipulate. Yet he also understood that reversing course would expose him, and that partial destabilization of the vigilantes without continued influence might result in uncontrolled violence. He found himself caught in the contradiction of needing to proceed while also witnessing the cost of his decisions. The fractures among the enslaved community also deepened. Some individuals noticed the main character's heightened awareness of the rider's movements and interpreted it as dangerous curiosity. Others, especially the younger boy who watched him closely, saw purpose in his behavior and attempted to emulate his attentiveness. The main character discouraged this imitation without explicit instruction, knowing that the boy lacked the experience to conceal his intentions. Still, he could not erase the boy's fascination, and he understood that any misstep by the youth could bring catastrophic consequences. Rumors continued to spread among the vigilantes, fueled by the farmhand's uncertainty. He began feeding inconsistent information to different riders, driven by his desire to appear useful while protecting himself from accusations. His clumsy attempts to manage information only heightened the confusion. Some vigilantes believed a high-ranking member was collaborating with abolitionist sympathizers. Others suspected that rival groups of riders were using the plantation as a testing ground for loyalty. These contradictions made their behavior increasingly erratic. They questioned the overseer more aggressively and arrived at hours that disrupted the workers' schedules. Their lack of unity amplified the anxiety felt by the enslaved people, who understood that unpredictable white men were more dangerous than cruel ones. The main character faced his first significant moral test when he encountered one of the vigilantes near the old boundary wall. The rider, unaware of the source of the rumors circulating among his group, appeared distressed and suspicious of his own companions. The main character recognized that he had the option to diffuse the rider's fears by providing clarity or redirecting him toward a target outside the plantation. Yet he chose silence. He understood that warning the rider would undermine the broader strategy and potentially expose his role in the rumor that was now spiraling within the group. His decision to avoid intervention marked an irreversible step. It transformed his earlier manipulations from a passive probing of weaknesses into an active choice to deepen the conflict. This moment of hesitation before choosing silence became a psychological turning point. He realized that he was now responsible for shaping the fears of men who held absolute power over his life. His plan no longer existed as a theoretical possibility, but had begun altering the behavior of the most volatile force in his environment. The consequences of this choice reverberated quickly. Later that week, news reached the plantation that one vigilante had confronted another in a neighboring pasture, accusing him of withholding information. The confrontation resulted in a violent scuffle that left one man bruised and the other threatening retaliation. These events spread through the region with the same speed as the earlier rumor, further destabilizing the structure that the main character hoped to dismantle. Meanwhile, the overseer grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of clarity from the vigilantes. He punished more frequently and questioned more aggressively, believing that the enslaved workers were concealing knowledge about the riders' disputes. His punishments became more severe, and even minor deviations from expected behavior were met with disproportionate responses. The overseer's agitation created an atmosphere of near-constant tension. The enslaved workers moved through their tasks like people navigating a battlefield where unpredictable bursts of violence could erupt without warning. The main character's internal conflict intensified as he saw the strain his actions placed on others. He had planned to manipulate the white vigilantes, not to harm his own community. Yet the system's instability guaranteed that his actions would always produce collateral consequences. He recognized that the enslaved people understood little about the source of the increased pressure, and he knew they would not suspect him, but their suffering weighed on him nonetheless. He struggled with the reality that any path toward freedom under such conditions required risks that extended beyond himself. As days passed, the plantation's routines deteriorated. The overseer and landowner argued more frequently, and the enslaved workers sensed that discipline was becoming reactive rather than structured. The riders' presence increased at irregular intervals, and their questions became sharper, directed as much at each other as at the enslaved. The farmhand appeared perpetually restless, unable to decide which side of the growing conflict he should align himself with. The younger boy began shadowing the main character more closely, sensing that he understood something the others did not. The main character tried to discourage the boy's curiosity by assigning him harmless tasks, but he could not fully remove his influence. The growing instability reached a critical point when a rumor spread that the vigilantes intended to hold a private meeting to address the issue of disloyalty. The farmhand mentioned this indirectly while unloading supplies, and the tension in his voice suggested that the meeting was not routine. The main character interpreted this as both danger and opportunity. A gathering where suspicions were aired openly could ignite violent conflict among the riders. At the same time, it could also lead to collective retaliation if the vigilantes concluded that their problems originated from the enslaved population. He needed to understand the purpose of the meeting without exposing himself. He spent the next hours observing how different riders behaved as word of the meeting circulated among them. Their movements reflected a mixture of apprehension and determination. They were preparing for something that required secrecy and force. The section moves toward its conclusion with the plantation's atmosphere approaching a breaking point. Every layer of the system, enslaved people, overseers, vigilantes, landowners, operated under suspicion, fear, or mistrust. The main character sensed that the conflict he had initiated was moving in the direction he hoped, but it was also becoming harder to control. As evening settled, he positioned himself carefully to observe the riders as they prepared for their meeting. Their tense gestures, whispered exchanges, and wary stares confirmed that the fractures widening between them were no longer small cracks, but structural weaknesses. He understood that the situation had reached a stage where his next decision could shape the course of the coming days, either bringing him closer to freedom or plunging the plantation into unpredictable violence. The stakes had risen, and the main character recognized that the path he had chosen now demanded a far more dangerous level of involvement. The consequences of the earlier manipulations began to settle over the plantation like a tightening band, creating an atmosphere where every movement, every whisper, every absence becomes a provocation for suspicion. In the days after the first vigilante assault on one of their own, the story of what happened spreads through the region in inconsistent fragments, carried partly by white riders who cannot agree on the details, and partly by enslaved men who overhear the aftermath while performing forced tasks near the barns or in the yard. The injured vigilante, who was found half-conscious with his hands bound and his mouth packed with rags, becomes an example that the group itself refuses to interpret directly. Some of them are convinced he betrayed them. Others believe he was framed. A few suspect that a deeper conspiracy is moving under their feet. None of them consider the possibility that the manipulation came from someone they believe intellectually inferior, someone they do not imagine capable of reading or intercepting written orders. This blind spot becomes the main character's shield, but also a source of unease, because unpredictability among his enemies is as dangerous as open hostility. Word of the incident reaches the landowner through one of the overseers, and the reaction is immediate. He does not shout or raise his fists. Instead, he falls into a state of controlled agitation that expresses itself through a series of new rules and commands. More patrols are sent out at night, and lanterns burn until dawn near the stable, the kitchen house, and the tobacco sheds. A small group of overseers begins inspecting every tool, every storage box, and every sleeping area, as if they expect rebellion to be hidden between wooden boards. The landowner walks with his hands clasped behind his back, issuing instructions that his subordinates interpret in harsher and harsher ways. A man who has lived his entire life believing his authority to be absolute cannot tolerate unexplained events. The disappearance of control feels to him like a crack in a stone wall, something that must be sealed with force before it spreads. The enslaved community responds to this shift with caution rather than collective emotion. Everyone understands that when white men become afraid, the consequences fall hardest on the powerless. The women keep the children inside after dark. The older men take on additional chores without complaint to avoid drawing attention. Even conversations in the quarters stop early, and instead an unnatural silence settles over the place where people once whispered stories by lamplight. The main character, who has already taken the first steps down a path he cannot reverse, watches this change with a sense of responsibility that burns at the edges of his thoughts. Each act of deception raises the possibility of suffering among people who had no say in his choices, a truth he tries to justify by reminding himself of the life he is fighting for and the brutality that would remain unchanged whether he intervened or not. The elder, who once offered careful advice and measured warnings, begins to withdraw. He performs his tasks in the fields and returns to the quarters without the faint expressions of solidarity he once allowed himself. He has seen too many consequences fall upon innocent bodies during his years in bondage, and he senses the tension thickening around the main character like smoke. Without saying anything, he creates distance as if hoping that physical space might shield him from whatever retribution is gathering. His silence becomes a quiet judgment, not condemnation, but fear disguised as detachment. For the main character, this distance carries a weight more cutting than spoken disapproval, because it suggests a loss of trust from one of the few people who once believed in measured caution and long-term survival. At the same time, the younger boy, who spends his days running errands and gathering scraps of information that adults overlook, grows more attached. He studies the main character with wide-eyed attentiveness, taking cues from him and interpreting survival as something linked to strategy rather than submission. When he witnesses the increased surveillance, he moves with more deliberate caution and follows the main character's unspoken patterns, believing that proximity brings protection. His loyalty is not born from naive admiration, but from the recognition that the main character's actions, even when dangerous, offer a possibility of change he has never seen before. The informant farmhand, the one who sells scraps of information for small favors, protection, or the illusion of belonging to powerful men, enters a state of visible panic as suspicion intensifies among the vigilantes. He tries to survive by telling different versions of overheard conversations to different writers, never realizing that the inconsistencies in his stories reveal his duplicity. His fear makes him sloppy. One vigilante hears from him that a certain writer has been secretly taking coin from a northern trader. Another hears that the group's leader keeps coded correspondence hidden beneath his saddle blanket. These contradictions feed into the paranoia that the main character has been cultivating from the shadows, deepening the fractures he needs for his plan to continue. Watching the informant's desperation, he understands that a person caught between loyalty and fear becomes an unpredictable element. He must account for that unpredictability as he decides on his next move. When the intercepted vigilante message reaches his hands, a rare opportunity that occurs only because a rider drops it in his haste, and an overseer orders the enslaved men to search the path for lost items. The main character recognizes it as a moment that will define everything that follows. The message contains a meeting location and a note concerning discipline within the group. By altering a few lines, he suggests that a respected senior member has been disposing of evidence and feeding information to outsiders. The handwriting is imprecise, but the vigilantes are accustomed to inconsistent penmanship. What matters is the implication, and once he folds the message back into the dirt-stained paper and places it where it will be found, he knows he has crossed a threshold that cannot be undone. If anyone traces the alteration back to him, his death will not be swift. It will be prolonged and made public, intended as both punishment and demonstration. After the altered message is delivered, the region enters a period of escalating harm. One slave cabin on a neighboring plantation burns in the middle of the night. The official explanation offered by the landowner is an accident caused by an overturned lantern, but every enslaved person in the county understands that such fires occur when white men wish to reassert dominance. The smoke drifts over the fields the next morning, and the survivors of the burned cabin are forced to rebuild while overseers watch from horseback. The main character sees the flames' aftermath and feels a tightening in his chest, because he knows that although he did not start the fire, his manipulation contributed to the panic that encouraged such an act of intimidation. He asks himself whether freedom purchased at this cost can still be called freedom, or whether survival at the expense of others is indistinguishable from another form of captivity. The vigilante outpost hidden deep in the woods becomes the site of the next eruption. A section of the shelter is found vandalized, its crude walls slashed, and several weapons missing. The vigilantes assume it was an internal betrayal rather than an external attack, since the area is remote and known only to their group. The idea that one of their own could have turned against them begins to circulate as a near certainty. Small confrontations break out among them. Accusations rise, retreat, and resurface. They question loyalties that were once taken for granted, and every man tries to appear more committed than the others, creating an atmosphere where exaggerated zeal becomes the new measure of trust. Back on the plantation, the environment grows increasingly unstable. Overseers interpret every hesitation, every misstep, every moment of delay as potential evidence of conspiracy. Tools are inspected twice, sometimes 3 times. Fields are monitored with an intensity that borders on obsession. The enslaved workers respond with practiced deference, but even perfect obedience does not protect them from suspicion. Suspicion has become the lens through which every action is viewed. The main character moves through this tightening world with deliberate stillness, performing his assigned tasks with mechanical precision while using every spare moment to observe the shifting patterns among his oppressors. His internal conflict intensifies. He understands that he has gained momentum, that the vigilantes are unraveling in a way that serves his plan. Yet he also watches the fear in the eyes of the people around him. The women who draw their children closer, the men who sleep lightly, the elder who avoids even shared glances. He feels the moral weight of having set these consequences into motion. The question he once held in distant contemplation becomes a constant presence. Is what he is doing justified? Or is he crossing a threshold beyond which survival becomes indistinguishable from complicity in harm? He wants to believe that the violence would happen regardless, that he is merely redirecting its path away from his own community and toward those who created it. But in the quiet hours before dawn, he cannot ignore the possibility that innocence is being swept into the storm he has helped generate. As the paranoia among the vigilantes continues to escalate, their leader announces that internal cleansing is necessary. The message carries a tone of righteous certainty, the kind used by men who believe that brutality is a necessary tool of order. They will meet again soon. They will identify the traitors. They will conduct what they call a purge. Their intention is not hidden. It is expressed in the rigid posture of their horses and the grim set of their mouths as they ride through the county. The enslaved workers sense what is coming, even if the details remain mysterious. Everyone feels the air tighten with dread. The main character prepares himself for the inevitable confrontation. He understands that the vigilantes will soon turn their violence inward with a ferocity unmatched by anything they have inflicted on others. He also understands that this moment, though dangerous, provides the opportunity he has been building toward. The collapse he has engineered is approaching its peak. But so too is the risk that his involvement will be discovered. His future, and the survival of those around him, now depend on whether he can stay ahead of the chaos he has unleashed. By the end of this phase, the group of white vigilantes has transformed from an organized force into a paranoid circle preparing to destroy its own members. The landowner senses that something has slipped beyond his control. The enslaved community braces for whatever the next act of violence will be. And the main character stands at the center of a storm he helped create, knowing that the next steps will decide whether his gamble leads to freedom or to a violent end. The collapse begins without ceremony. What started as scattered distrust in the vigilante circle hardens into rigid factions that no longer exchange information, but instead interpret silence as evidence of betrayal. Riders who once patrolled together now avoid meeting one another's eyes. They sharpen their tools separately, saddle their horses without speaking, and study one another's movements with a vigilance once reserved only for supposed external enemies. The altered message the main character planted has done its work, and the inconsistent stories spread by the panicked farmhand deepen the schism until it reaches a point where reconciliation is no longer possible. Information becomes currency traded through implication, and every man attempts to present himself as the most loyal by accusing someone else of treachery. By late evening on the 4th day of rising anxiety, the vigilantes organize a secret meeting in the woods, a gathering meant to clarify accusations but destined to accelerate them. The forest, which previously served as their private ground for planning and intimidation, becomes the stage for their unraveling. Torches burn low, muffled voices move among the trees, and the group arrives in disjointed sequences rather than as a cohesive unit. The main character hides a short distance away, concealed behind a fallen trunk and dense brush. He has planned for this confrontation, yet he cannot fully control the variables now spiraling forward. His task is no longer to push events, but to understand where to place himself in relation to the violence he anticipates. As the vigilantes assemble, the meeting starts in an atmosphere already charged with resentment. Men stand in small clusters, avoiding the center, each group watching another with the suspicion of individuals who feel they may not leave the forest unharmed. Someone gestures toward a crumpled piece of paper. Someone else points at a torn section of saddle leather, supposedly found near a vandalized outpost. None of them have the clarity to recognize how much of their evidence is circumstantial or planted. The tension reaches a breaking point when one rider steps forward and calls attention to the injuries suffered by the vigilante previously found beaten. His argument is that only an insider would have known where the man would be alone. Another rider counters by referencing the altered message, claiming that the accused man must have been trying to destroy the letter before any meetings took place. The accusations loop into a circular argument that cannot be resolved without force. The first gunshot splits the air like a fracture traveling through bone. It is not clear who fired it. The main character sees the flash, but cannot identify the shooter before the second shot follows. Two men fall, one immediately, the other after staggering a few steps and collapsing beside a tree. Horses rear. Half the group dives for cover. The other half raises weapons in a frenzy of self-defense. The forest fills with shouting, but the words lose meaning in the chaos. Torches drop into the underbrush, and the flames cast erratic shadows that make it impossible for the men to distinguish allies from adversaries. Years of resentment, fear, and misplaced loyalty ignite in a few minutes of violent confusion. The main character understands that this moment is decisive. The conflict can either implode entirely or regain focus in a way that would threaten him and everyone on the plantation. He watches the splintering of the group with a mixture of calculated focus and cold dread. The vigilantes have become what he engineered, a force turned inward, unable to recognize that their panic is self-generated. If they manage to reorganize and identify a common enemy, their attention will return to the enslaved population. Therefore, he must make sure their collapse continues into total fracturing, something that cannot be reversed by morning. While the vigilantes fight one another, the overseer on the plantation launches an entirely separate assault driven by his own suspicions. The landowner's anxiety has pushed him to demand immediate control, and the overseer, interpreting this demand as permission for any measure, begins rounding up enslaved people under the pretext of restoring order. The younger boy is seized first, dragged from the yard where he had been gathering tools. The overseer believes the boy knows something, or at least believes the boy's fear will force others to confess. His actions are not based on evidence, but on the long-standing assumption that suffering produces compliance. The boy is pulled toward a makeshift holding area, an improvised site near the barn, lit by 2 lanterns and marked by ropes tied between fence posts. When news of the roundup reaches the main character through hurried whispers from enslaved men returning from evening work, he experiences a surge of urgency stronger than anything he felt while manipulating the vigilantes. His plan never included allowing the boy to fall into the overseer's hands. The boy has remained close to him not only physically but symbolically, representing the possibility that someone young might learn a different form of survival than the elder's resigned caution. Losing him to the overseer's brutality would collapse the fragile justification the main character has relied upon through the darker moments of his manipulation. He calculates quickly. The vigilantes are already collapsing. The overseer is launching a brutal demonstration of authority. However, neither side is aware of what the other is doing. If he intervenes directly, he exposes himself. If he allows the boy to become collateral damage, he betrays the moral boundary he has tried to maintain. Therefore, he decides on a third option: redirect the violence of one group toward the other, accelerating their conflict until they consume one another. It is the most dangerous decision he has ever made, but it is also the one that offers the only viable path forward. He moves through the woods with the stealth of someone who has spent his entire life learning how to avoid detection. He positions himself between the two sites, the collapsing vigilante meeting and the overseer's holding area, and begins creating the illusion of an approaching threat. He snaps branches deliberately, throws stones into brush patches near where the vigilantes' horses are tethered, and leaves traces resembling hurried footprints leading in the direction of the overseer's lanterns. His intention is to make the vigilantes believe that someone is fleeing toward the plantation to alert an enemy. At the same time, he approaches the overseer's camp from the opposite direction, mimicking the sound of multiple riders moving through the trees. The overseer, on edge from his own violent certainty, interprets these sounds as confirmation that vigilantes are coming to challenge his authority. The plantation has never been a unified command. Overseers and vigilantes cooperate only when it suits their interests. With suspicion already thick among them, it takes only a hint of imagined aggression for each side to assume the other is launching an attack. By the time the vigilantes reach the edge of the plantation grounds, they are half a unit, half a mob. Their weapons are drawn, their breathing uneven. The men who fell earlier remain in the forest, creating a further sense of martyrdom and revenge among the survivors. They believe the overseer, or whoever the overseer is protecting, must be responsible for the betrayal that has cost them members and pride. The inconsistent lies fed by the informant have convinced them that the overseer's camp hides evidence or a traitor. The altered message created by the main character, combined with the scattered vandalism, pushed them toward this conclusion long before the confrontation began. The overseer sees the shadows of armed riders emerging through the treeline and immediately assumes the vigilantes are coming to seize the boy or to accuse him of mismanaging the plantation. His suspicion turns into aggressive preparedness. He orders the enslaved men nearby to stand aside, positions himself between the lanterns with his weapon ready, and prepares for a confrontation that neither side will be able to de-escalate. The clash unfolds in confusion rather than strategy. The vigilantes move forward expecting resistance. The overseer responds expecting attack. When he raises his weapon, they interpret the motion as confirmation of guilt. The first shot fired in this second confrontation pierces the night with the same destructive force as the shots exchanged in the woods earlier. At the sound, the main character pulls the younger boy toward the edge of the field and into the cover of dense trees. The boy stumbles but keeps moving, understanding that hesitation will result in capture or worse. Behind them, the battle between vigilantes and overseer escalates. Horses rear and break loose. Lanterns shatter, and the lights cast chaotic shadows that distort the shapes of men into threatening silhouettes. Both sides believe the other has been undermining them for months. The vigilantes, convinced that the overseer protected a traitor, fight with desperation. The overseer, believing he has been abandoned and targeted by the landowner's unofficial enforcers, responds with frantic aggression. The enslaved workers nearby scatter into the darkness, unwilling to be trapped between two violent forces that have never considered them human. The main character and the boy reach the woods just as the confrontation behind them reaches its peak. Several vigilantes fall in the exchange, and the overseer suffers a severe injury that forces him to the ground. The harsh hierarchy of the plantation collapses under the weight of its internal fractures. The landowner, still at the main house unaware of the full extent of the chaos, will soon find that the system he relied upon has disintegrated overnight. As the main character guides the boy deeper into the forest, he listens to the echo of gunfire fading behind him. The violence, though horrifying, confirms that his intervention reshaped the conflict in the precise way he intended. The oppressors are destroying one another, each side convinced the other represents the root of their losses. Their mistrust has reached a point beyond repair. By dawn, the vigilante group will be shattered, the overseer incapacitated, and the remaining authority figures too uncertain or frightened to reassert control. Yet the cost weighs on him as heavily as the boy's trembling hand gripping his sleeve. Men have died, some in confusion, others in blind retribution. The plantation will never return to its former structure, but the destruction required to break its hierarchy came with consequences he cannot ignore. His plan succeeded, but at a price paid not only by the guilty. The fractured system around him did not collapse quietly. It shattered with violence that will echo through the community long after he escapes its immediate reach. By the time he and the boy disappear fully into the woods, the night behind them has transformed into a field of broken factions and collapsing power. Freedom is no longer a distant concept shaped by stories and dreams. It has become a narrow path carved through the ruin of men who underestimated him. He knows the next steps will determine whether this freedom is temporary or lasting, but for the first time, the path ahead belongs to him rather than those who once controlled his every movement. The climax has concluded, but its consequences have only begun. The aftermath settled over the ruined plantation like a heavy, unmoving fog, dense enough to smother breath and thought alike. In the first days after the confrontation, the land seemed paralyzed, as though the soil itself recoiled from the events that had torn through it. The landowner, a man once obsessed with authority and order, barricaded himself inside the main house and refused to step onto the porch. He moved through his rooms in jittering silence, keeping shutters closed and lamps burning from morning until night. Servants reported hearing him pace in circles, stopping only to glance toward the distant tree line, as if expecting someone to emerge from the forest carrying retribution he no longer felt certain he did not deserve. He issued no instructions, made no proclamations, and avoided every living soul on the property. For decades he had relied on fear to command obedience. Now fear was the only companion he had left. The vigilante group that once operated with theatrical confidence collapsed almost immediately. Some members were dead, claimed by the final violent clash that had erupted when suspicion outpaced reason. Others fled into the countryside, abandoning homes, debts, and families in their frantic attempts to escape the consequences of the lies they believed, the secrets they shared, and the blood they shed in confusion. A few wandered into nearby towns and turned themselves in, offering wildly contradictory accounts of what had occurred. Their stories tangled into a mesh so incoherent that local authorities could not determine who had wronged whom. Some insisted the overseer had been orchestrating a conspiracy against them. Others accused fellow vigilantes of collusion with abolitionist agents. A few hinted that the plantation itself had been cursed. No narrative held its shape for more than a sentence or two before dissolving into contradiction. The sheriff attempted to take statements, but abandoned the effort when each retelling mutated into another version, as unstable as the men who delivered it. Meanwhile, the enslaved community moved through the wreckage of hierarchy with quiet caution. Days passed without clear directives, creating a limbo where no one could anticipate the next blow or blessing. The disappearance of the main character and the younger boy sparked whispers among those who had known them, though no one dared speak too loudly lest the landowner suddenly reassert control. Some believed the two had perished in the chaos, swallowed by the violence they had tried to outrun. Others, more hopeful, believed they had escaped into the northern woods, guided by providence or cleverness or sheer opportunity. Still others said nothing at all, unwilling to attach words to events that might someday return through the mouths of white men desperate for someone to blame. The main character and the younger boy hid in the woods during those first hours after the confrontation, listening to the distant echoes of shouts and gunfire die into silence. They moved only when darkness offered cover, navigating between branches and roots by instinct and faint moonlight. The boy trembled at every sound, still gripped by the memory of being seized, held captive by men who intended to break him as easily as they broke tools. The older fugitive kept him close, understanding that the path forward demanded both stealth and speed. They traveled by night for days, stopping only long enough to gather berries, drink from streams, and rest in thickets that shielded them from view. Fear remained their constant companion, but fear had long been familiar to them, and they accepted it as the cost of moving towards something better than the world they had left behind. As they journeyed northward, they encountered scattered news carried through rumor rather than formal record. A traveling peddler passed within earshot of their hiding place and spoke to a farmer about a vigilante group whose members had turned on one another in what he called a madness born of internal betrayal. A pair of laborers mentioned hearing that devils had taken hold of the men on the plantation, driving them into murderous paranoia. A camp of loggers told a version in which an enslaved man manipulated the group so brilliantly that they killed each other believing they were eradicating traitors. The boy listened to these rumors with wide eyes, unsure which version was closest to the truth. The older man knew each held a grain of accuracy and a handful of distortions. Rumor traveled faster than fact, and each retelling reshaped events into something more dramatic or more frightening or more convenient for the teller's audience. Among the enslaved population on nearby estates, stories filtered from mouth to mouth, shrinking or swelling depending on who recounted them. Some praised the chaos as long overdue justice, a moment where oppressors tasted the confusion and helplessness they so casually inflicted on others. Others feared what might follow, suspecting that white landowners in the region would retaliate with disproportionate punishment once they regained their footing. Still others treated the incident as a cautionary tale, warning that any action to destabilize the established order might bring suffering upon the innocent. Within the hushed corridors of slave cabins, truth became something fluid and unstable, shaped by emotion and fear as much as by memory. The older man's name was whispered in awe by some, in anxiety by others, and in curiosity by many who wondered what could drive one person to push an entire system into collapse. For the main character himself, freedom tasted sharper than he expected. In the stolen hours of their escape northward, he found himself haunted by the consequences of his choices. His mind returned often to the sight of bodies falling during the confrontation, reminders that his manipulations had not been clean threads of strategy, but messy, dangerous forces that tore through real lives. He had wanted survival. He had wanted freedom. He had wanted a chance to carve a future not bound by chains. Yet he had not intended to orchestrate deaths beyond those that came after him directly. Now he grappled with a heavy truth. Indirect actions can still leave blood on a conscience, and no distance from the scene erased the weight of responsibility. He knew the men who died had been part of a system designed to crush him, but he also recognized that their deaths were not abstract corrections of injustice, but the extinguishing of lives he had pushed into conflict. The question he had long avoided rose again and again in his thoughts. Does the morality of survival depend on the methods chosen or the circumstances forcing them? The boy, for his part, viewed him with unwavering loyalty. He believed the older man had saved him, had saved others, had become something akin to a mythological figure in a world starved of heroes. That belief only intensified the man's internal struggle, for he feared that admiration born of incomplete knowledge might blind the boy to the complexities of what had taken place. Yet he could not bring himself to dampen the hope the boy held, for hope was a fragile gift rarely granted in the world they had both endured. Instead, he listened to the boy's questions, answered with care, and guided their steps northward toward the uncertain promise of a life they could shape on their own terms. As they left Virginia and edged closer to safer territory, the stories about the events they had left behind grew even more strange. Some claimed the vigilantes had summoned spirits that turned upon them. Others insisted that abolitionist operatives had infiltrated the region and sowed seeds of discord. A particularly imaginative rumor suggested that a coded letter, written in invisible ink, had ignited the entire disaster. These tales drifted through taverns, markets, and work camps like dust, settling briefly before being swept into the next retelling. None matched the truth entirely. All captured something essential about human nature's need to explain chaos through narrative. The man understood that history often shaped itself through such distortions, that the record of events depended less on what happened and more on what people chose to believe. Back on the plantation, the remnants of the enslaved community tried to rebuild some sense of rhythm, though the structure around them had fractured. The overseer, wounded in the final confrontation, lingered on the edge of life for several days before succumbing to infection and fever. Without his harsh hand, some found temporary reprieve, while others feared that whoever replaced him might be worse. The landowner, overwhelmed by fear and disorientation, eventually fled the property under cover of night, leaving it in the hands of distant relatives who arrived weeks later to restore order. By then, the enslaved people had settled into a cautious routine, but the specter of repercussions remained ever present. Some whispered relief that the man and boy had escaped, believing their absence shielded the rest from suspicion. Others lamented that their departure left the community without a figure of resistance who had briefly reminded them that agency, however small, could exist even within oppression. As the man and boy pushed deeper north, crossing rivers and dirt roads and abandoned paths, the older fugitive allowed himself moments of reflection. He reconsidered every step he had taken, weighing intention against outcome. He recognized that freedom gained through deception was still freedom, yet he wondered whether the moral ledger of his life would forever carry the shadow of the deaths that had followed his actions. He understood that in a world built on brutality, resisting brutality often demanded strategies that mirrored its ruthlessness. Still, he felt the tension between survival and guilt, between necessity and conscience, between triumph and burden. These contradictions accompanied him like unseen companions, shaping the silent hours of their journey. Their path eventually intersected with the faint network of individuals and safe houses quietly aiding those fleeing bondage. Here, stories of the plantation reached them again, retold by strangers who had never stepped foot on the land. A conductor spoke of a Virginia estate consumed by madness, where violent men destroyed themselves in a frenzy of mutual suspicion. Another rescuer recounted a rumor of an enslaved man who had outwitted his oppressors through strategy so intricate it bordered on supernatural. The boy listened in awe each time, recognizing pieces of their story refracted through exaggeration. The older man listened with mixed emotion, hearing how easily truth warped into legend. In the quiet moments between each extraction point, he grappled with the moral consequences that refused to fade. Freedom was no longer merely a goal but a state he inhabited, and with it came a clarity he had been denied during years of survival under surveillance. He understood that he had acted within the confines of a world that gave him no peaceful alternatives. The oppressive structure had left him only two paths: submission that guaranteed suffering or resistance that carried catastrophic risk. Yet the knowledge did not fully silence the uneasy stir within his conscience. He questioned whether future generations, if they ever learned of what had happened, would judge him harshly or with understanding shaped by time. When at last they crossed into territory where the threat of capture loosened its grip, the man allowed himself to consider a life defined not by escape, but by presence. The boy walked beside him with a steadiness born of growing confidence, and the man saw in him a reflection of what might have been possible for many others if the world were different. They found refuge in a small community that welcomed fugitives discreetly, offering them both space to breathe without fear of immediate pursuit. Here, the man observed how stories of resistance traveled further than those of quiet endurance, how people sought narratives that affirmed courage in the face of inhumanity. He wondered whether the fragments of his story drifting through the region would one day settle into something coherent enough to be remembered. In the wider world, the plantation incident became a hazy tale discussed only when someone sought to illustrate how violent systems crumble under their own weight. No official record captured the details. No authority pieced together the true sequence of events. The survivors, too traumatized or too ashamed, rarely spoke of it. The enslaved community, burdened by fear of retribution, kept its memories close, passing them only in whispered retellings that shifted with each new generation. Over time, the truth dissolved into a mixture of fact and myth, a narrative shaped as much by silence as by words. Historians decades later would find nothing but vague references, suggesting something catastrophic had happened, but offering no clarity regarding its cause. The man understood that history had no obligation to honor accuracy. It honored whatever version survived the longest, whatever story fit neatly into the frames people wanted to believe. He realized that his escape, his choices, and his moral struggle might one day be reduced to a cautionary tale, or a heroic myth, or an obscure footnote. The thought did not disturb him as much as he expected. What mattered most was that he had secured freedom for himself and the boy, carving out a future that had once seemed unattainable. Yet in the quiet hours before sleep, when the noise of the world fell away, he returned to the central moral question that had shaped the heart of his journey. Could survival ever be clean when the system designed to destroy him left no room for purity? Could resistance be judged by the standards of a world built to deny him humanity? Was justice measured by outcomes or intentions? He suspected the answers would remain tangled, perhaps unresolvable. But he also understood that moral clarity was a luxury rarely afforded to those living under oppression. As seasons shifted and the man and boy began to build a life that belonged to them alone, he found a measure of peace in knowing that their story, however distorted by rumor, carried a thread of truth. Resistance, in all its moral complexity, was possible. He knew the world would continue wrestling with the price of such resistance long after he was gone. And he hoped, quietly and without certainty, that future generations might see in his choices not a tale of destruction, but a testimony to the human will to survive, even when survival demanded impossible decisions. In the end, the legacy of what had happened on that plantation rested not in the contradictory accounts told by frightened men or the fragmented whispers that crossed counties and borders. It rested in the enduring question left behind, a question that refused simple answers. When the world denies a person justice, what becomes of morality, and what cost must one bear to reclaim the freedom stolen at birth?